Rain or shine, we're teaching Christian Basics, Lesson 30, Holy Week. Oh, this is a good one. I need my hands. Okay, let me stop. The geography to get Holy Week is, we want to remember that there's kind of two hills in Jerusalem. So you have Mount Zion, and that's where the city is. That's where the temple is, and Jerusalem, all this stuff. And then you go down the valley, and then up on the other side, that's the Kidron Valley, and that's the Mount of Olives that's there. And the Garden of Gethsemane is here on the side of the Mount of Olives, and on the other side of the Mount of Olives is Bethany. That's where Mary, Martha, and Lazarus live, over in Bethany. And that's going to be Jesus' headquarters all through Holy Week. So, Holy Week is an amazing thing to think about, that half of the Gospel of John and a third of the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, just as far as the space is concerned, are concerned with that last 8 days. I suppose if you extend it to Easter, 9, 10 days of the life of Jesus, starting with Palm Sunday, the first day of the week, the triumphal entry of Jesus into Jerusalem. And the way it works is this: Jesus came up with his disciples, and they're staying in Bethany. And again, Bethany is going to be the kind of the main base for their activity. And on that Sunday, Jesus says to his disciples, go and get a donkey, and they go and get the donkey. Jesus rides down the Mount of Olives with the crowd from Bethany. The crowd from Jerusalem comes up to meet him, and they travel down into Jerusalem. Jesus looks around. The Pharisees are all worked up what he's doing and everything. He looks around, and then he leaves, goes back to Bethany. Then Holy Monday, Jesus comes back, Bethany to Jerusalem. He curses the fig tree. He cleanses the temple. That all happens on Holy Monday. Then he's back to Bethany. Holy Tuesday is a big day. It's the last public day of Jesus' teaching, Holy Tuesday. And he goes from Bethany over to Jerusalem, and he goes into the temple, and he teaches there in the temple, and they come to question him. That's when you have the three big questions that they give to Jesus. They say, what's the greatest commandment? And Jesus says, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbors yourself. The second one is like it. On these two hang all the law and the prophets. They asked Jesus this question about the resurrection. They say there was a woman who was married to a man, and then that guy, they didn't have any kids, and the guy died. So then his brother married her. This is the old Levirate marriage law, I think it's what it's called. And then he died, and the next brother married her. They didn't have any kids. Then he died. Now at some point, like, you're the fourth and the fifth and the sixth brother, you're thinking, I don't know if this seems like a good idea. But 7 brothers all die. None have kids. And so they say, well, whose wife will she be in the resurrection? Now, the reason they were asking this is because they didn't believe in the resurrection. These guys. Jesus answered it. You neither know the scriptures or the power of God. And the resurrection will be like the angels in heaven, neither married nor given in marriage. And then they ask the question of the tax coin. Remember, they say, should you pay taxes to Caesar? It's another one of those damned if you do, damned if you don't. Because if Jesus says, yeah, pay taxes to Caesar, they say, what kind of Messiah are you? And if he says, no, don't pay taxes to Caesar, then they arrest him. Anyway, Jesus says, show me the coin. Whose picture? Caesar? Give to Caesar what's Caesar's. Give to God what's God's. It's just brilliant. And then Jesus takes them apart with this question, whose son is the Messiah? David's, they say. David, 2 Samuel 7. And Jesus says, well, why does David say in the Spirit, the Lord said to my Lord, sit here at my right hand? How can David's Lord speak to God? How can he be David's Lord and David's son at the same time? Now, they don't know the incarnation. They're confounded about it. It's one of those riddles of the Scripture. We know that Jesus is David's son and David's Lord because he's both God and man. Anyway, they leave the temple. Jesus curses. He says all these woes to them. Matthew 23, woes to the Pharisees. He sees them they're like extortioners. They're stealing everyone's money. The widow's there. She's giving her last mite. And that launches Jesus into a tirade about the Pharisees. They devour widows' houses. And then they go down the Kidron Valley and up to the top of Mount Olives. As they're going past, they go past the temple, and the disciples are like anybody. Whenever you go to Jerusalem and you're at the base of you're like, wow, look at how huge. How did they move these stones without cranes? So the disciples say, look at the size of these rocks. And Jesus says, well, not one will be on top of another. And so they ask him about this. So he gets to the top of Mount Olives and he gives what's called the Olivet Discourse, called that because it was on the top of the Mount of Olives. And he tells them about the destruction of Jerusalem and the end of the world. It's Matthew 24, 25, and parallels and so forth. Well, that's Holy Tuesday on the way back to Bethany. Holy Wednesday, we don't know what happens. It's a silent day in the life of Jesus. We think that maybe that was the day that Judas went into town to make the contract, to make the deal with the temple to betray Jesus for 30 pieces of silver. And then it's later in the day on Holy Thursday, what's sometimes called Maundy Thursday, from the Latin mandatum, a mandate. Jesus says, a new commandment I give to you, that Jesus goes into Jerusalem and he finds the upper room, probably the house of Mark, and there he celebrates the Lord's Supper. He gives the gift of his body and blood, more on that in upcoming lessons, for the forgiveness of sins. It's a perpetual institution in the church. And then he washes the disciples' feet, and then Judas goes out to betray him. Jesus teaches and instructs this long discourse there. They leave and sing a hymn. And then it's as night is falling on Thursday night, so this would be already on the day of Friday. Remember the Jewish calendar, the day starts at sunset, when you can see 2 stars at a glance or 3 stars at a glance, something like that. They're out of Jerusalem and they're down through the Kidron Valley on the side of the Mount of Olives at the Garden of Gethsemane. It's there at the garden that Jesus is praying, and here he goes into this deep and profound humiliation. He's bleeding great drops of blood. His disciples go with him, and then Peter, James, and John go a little way, and Jesus goes further. They're sleeping, and Jesus is praying 3 times, Lord, if it's possible, let this cup pass from me, but not my will, but thy will be done. It's incredible. And then when he's finished his prayers, he comes back to the disciples, he wakes them up and says, it's time. Now's the hour of darkness. And Judas comes with a band of kind of security guards from the temple, these thugs. And they come to arrest Jesus. He betrays them with a kiss. Who do you seek? Jesus says, who do you seek? They say, Jesus of Nazareth. I'm he. And they fall down. They tumble over. Just so you don't get the idea that Jesus is somehow not in control of this whole mess. Well, they come and arrest Jesus. Peter chops off Malchus's ear. Jesus fixes it. The disciples scatter. They bind Jesus. They drag him to the house of Annas, and he's going to go now 5 trials. The house of Annas, then the house of Caiaphas before the Sanhedrin, and those are the 2 Jewish trials, and they last through the night, and they're bringing in all these witnesses, but none of them can agree. And finally, Jesus, the high priest says to Jesus, "Are you the Son of God?" He answered plainly, and he says, "The day's coming when you will see the Son of Man sitting on the clouds, coming in great glory." And he tears his robe, and he says, "What further evidence do we need?" And so Jesus has blasphemed. Certainly, it would be blasphemy if he wasn't God. They beat Jesus. The indignities begin, and they drag Jesus to the palace of Pilate. Pilate was, remember when Jesus was born, Herod ruled over, Herod the Great he's called, because he built big things. He was, I suppose, a handy architect. He was also cruel. He ruled the whole place. When he died, he divided the kingdom, or the kingdom was divided into 3 tetrarchs, 3 little rules, and one was in the north, and one was in Judea, and the other was kind of in the south. Well, I think it was Philip, was one of his sons, was the tetrarch of Judea. Someone will surely correct me if I'm wrong about this in the comments. But Philip was the tetrarch, and he was just kind of a fool. He didn't last but for a couple of years, and Rome pulled him out and put in a governor. And so that's what Pilate was. He was the governor of this region of Judea, the Roman official. So they wanted to kill Jesus, but they didn't have the authority to kill him. Even though Rome let the Sanhedrin stay in place, they took away from them the right for capital punishment. So the Sanhedrin could maybe even beat people, arrest people, fine people, but they couldn't execute people. So they gotta enlist the help of the Romans. So they drag Jesus before Pilate. This is his 3rd trial, and he interviews. He has an audience with Pilate. He answers him, "What is truth?" You remember the whole famous thing. Pilate then doesn't think that Jesus has done anything worthy of death, so he's always trying to let him go this whole time. He finds out that Jesus is from Galilee, and so he sends him to Herod, the son of Herod, who is the ruler in Galilee, but in Jerusalem for the Passover. Sends him over to Herod's castle. Jesus doesn't say a word to Herod. He refuses to answer him. It's stunning, really. And so they mock him, put robes on him, put a crown of thorns, put the crown on him, give him a staff. They make fun of him, and they send him back to Pilate, who then takes Jesus and puts him before the people. Behold the man. Here's Jesus in his crown of thorns with this fake staff. Behold the man, they say. And Pilate had this custom that on the Passover he would pardon someone. So Pilate knows that the Pharisees had handed Jesus over because of envy. And he knows that the crowds are generally on Jesus and John the Baptist's side. And so he sees a way out. He's going to get the crowds to ask for Jesus to be released. So he asks them who I should release to you. And the Sanhedrin and the Pharisees go around and they stir up the crowds and they ask for Barabbas to be released. What should I do with Jesus? Crucify him. They yell, crucify him, crucify him. Pilate washes his hands. You crucify him. And they say, his blood be on us and on our children forever. And so he hands him over, and Jesus is whipped and beaten and then led to be crucified. He's so weak by this point that he can't carry his cross after he comes out of town. And so Simon the Cyrene, a man coming in from the country, has to carry the cross of Jesus to Golgotha, or Calvary, the place where Jesus will be crucified. And there he is crucified at 9 o'clock in the morning. We know the specifics of the hour. 9 o'clock in the morning, Jesus is crucified, and he's hanging on the cross for 6 hours. From noon until 3, there's darkness covering the face of the earth, and Jesus preaches 3 sermons from the cross. 3 at the beginning, 1 in the middle, 3 at the end. He says, the first thing he says, Father, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing. Unbelievable. And then he gives Mary to John and John to Mary. Woman, behold your son. Son, behold your mother. And he says to the thief crucified next to him, today you'll be with me in paradise. And then Matthew and Mark both give it to us that in the middle of this whole thing, Jesus cries out Psalm 22. Matthew gives it to us in the Hebrew, Mark in the Aramaic. Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani. My God, why have you forsaken me? And then at the very end, I thirst. It's finished. Father, into your hands I commit my spirit. And Jesus dies. And the curtain in the temple is torn in two. And there's an earthquake. Rocks are falling over. The centurion that's there says, truly this was the Son of God. And the people are wailing and weeping. The Jews had asked, because the next day was a Sabbath day and they didn't want to have the bodies there hanging on the cross, that they had asked that the bodies be taken down, and so Pilate gave permission, so they came to kill them, to speed the death by breaking their legs. So they broke the legs of the man on the right of Jesus and on the left of Jesus. They couldn't lift themselves up to get a breath, and they would suffocate in the fluids gathering in their lungs. But Jesus was already dead, and so they ran a spear through his side, and out came water and blood. And Jesus is hastily taken off the cross. He's wrapped. He's prepared for burial. He's laid in a nearby tomb owned by Joseph of Arimathea, one of the Sanhedrin, who was a believer in Jesus, but secretly. And they marked the spot where he was, and they rolled the stone over the tomb. Remember, the tombs in those days were reusable. They were little rooms, and there was places where you would lay to decompose for a year, and then when you were done with that, your bones were in a box on the shelf in the ossuary. But nobody had ever used this tomb before, so Jesus is laid there, and they seal it. They set a seal and a guard because they had heard the rumor. In fact, the Pharisees were more worried about the resurrection of Jesus than his own disciples were. And then everybody went home. And nothing happens the next day, Saturday. Jesus rests in the tomb, but then early on Sunday, he's risen. And the events of Easter are incredible. Jesus They come to the tomb, they find it rolled away. The women scatter, some this way, some that. They see an angel, some don't. John and Peter come running, Mary with them. Mary stays. She meets Jesus. Jesus meets Peter on the road. The other women on the road, they go to tell the other disciples. They all gather together. 2 go to Emmaus. The rest are there when Jesus comes to show them his hands and his side, except for Thomas. And it just kind of goes crazy. For 40 days, Jesus appears to them about 15 different times and shows himself to them risen and alive, until they're all gathered together 40 days after the resurrection of Jesus, and he blesses them and he ascends into heaven. And they're sitting there watching Jesus as he ascends into heaven, and the angel comes and says, why are you staring up into heaven? Jesus will come back the same way he's left. And Jesus goes to take up his full rule of his divine authority in heaven and on earth by sitting down at the right hand of the Father and ruling and reigning all things for us. So that's the event of Holy Week, this most important 10 days in the life of Jesus. And this is Teaching Christian Basics. That's lesson 30. Teaching Christian Basics.